Pixel, can you activate the autopilot? I'm gonna try and get back to the review. Don't tell me the autopilot was knocked out. What happened to my recording monitor? That's crazy. The only thing that can interfere with the ship would be something that can alter fixed points in time. Eh, fine. You mind if I borrow your monitor? Alright, in that case, let's get back to the review. Well, we looked at Sonic's story, so let's look at Edgy the Hedgies. Shadow's story begins with him on a special mission from the President to save a gun agent. You would think he would think twice about working with Gun or the President, but I guess this must be community service for what he did in the last game. The more interesting thing is the agent he has to rescue is Rouge, who had snuck into Eggman's base to steal the Scepter of Darkness. No idea why Gun wants it, but we have to help Rouge escape anyway. Oh, and on the way, we fight Eggman's giant guard dog that was in Sonic's playthrough. Didn't know where else to put it, just thought I'd mention. With that taken care of, we teleport out of Eggman's base and to Soliana. Rouge tries to tell Shadow why she was sent to get the scepter, which, funnily enough, a gun agent refers to as the Book of Darkness, which is probably a holdover from an earlier draft of the story, or something. Shadow, of course, doesn't care about the scepter and just wants to get the job done. Rouge asks Shadow to take her to a rendezvous point, which happens to be in Soliana's old castle. Shadow begrudgingly takes her there after dealing with annoying vehicle sections. Just to bring this up, Shadow plays almost exactly like Sonic. However, he's not as fast as Sonic, with his gameplay being more focused on combat as opposed to just speed sections trying to get through a stage. He is also required to use vehicles that are just clunky. The controls are already stiff enough, but the vehicles are somehow slippery. It just doesn't seem to add up. Hell, if the vehicles weren't necessary when they were there, it wouldn't be as much of a problem, but the first stage requires you to use one of these vehicles just to destroy spotlights because Shadow's own abilities can't take them down on its own. Immediately afterwards, in Shadow's second stage, you are required to use a hovercraft to go across the water. This hovercraft can immediately kill you just trying to get into the water, because the game just suddenly wants the hovercraft to crash if you nosedive into the water, as opposed to just taking a bit of health from the vehicle. On top of that, if you don't already know about the obstacles, you'll die multiple times just trying to get to the next checkpoint. These are the first two stages in Shadow's story, and for the game to require this level of accuracy, especially when the game doesn't grant that accuracy with these vehicles, is too much to ask. These games are targeted towards a 7 to 13-year-old audience, and this is too difficult for that audience. Anyway, getting back to the story, once at this rendezvous point, Rouge and Shadow are immediately ambushed by Eggman's forces as he tries to get the scepter back, which results in it being shattered when Eggman attacks a fleeing Rouge. Once the scepter breaks, Eggman retreats, frightened, as a pillar of darkness shoots from where the scepter broke. Once the pillar wipes out Eggman's bots, it takes Shadow's shadow and transforms into a form similar to his. This is Mephiles the Dark, and he seems to know Shadow personally. As thanks for freeing him, Mephiles sends Shadow and Rouge to the future, which at least explains why they are suddenly there in Sonic's story. In fact, we almost immediately meet with Sonic and the gang and explain the situation before going to find the Chaos Emeralds. Luckily, I already explained this bit in Sonic's story, so I don't have to go over it again, But whereas Sonic and his group do go to the past, the only one in Shadow's group that happens to return is Rouge. Shadow, seeing Mephiles and a random flame, gives chase just as the time rift closes. Rouge, realizing Shadow is still in the future, decides to find Gamma, who they did see in that future earlier. Knowing that he survives that long, she gives him the task of helping Shadow in the future and gives him the Chaos Emerald that she brought back with her. Meanwhile, back in the future, Shadow confronts Mephiles to fight him. Mephiles, during this time, tries to get Shadow to join him by explaining that humans ended up imprisoning him after considering him a threat. Which does make a bit of sense. That's kind of what happened in Sonic Adventure 2. Shadow, of course, doesn't go with Mephiles because he dealt with this shit in his own game. Before Mephiles can get to Shadow, Gamma shows up to give Shadow support, before Mephiles escapes through another time rift with Shadow and Gamma close behind. However, despite taking the exact same time rift, Shadow and Gamma end up back in Soleanna's town with Mephiles nowhere in sight. This is just something that bothers me about the story of this game. That's not to say the story is good by any means, but the time travel doesn't make sense. Time travel already is a chaotic plot point, and I know that from experience as a writer. The problem I have is the game doesn't explain or really set any rules for how this time travel works. The characters are able to use rifts in time to travel, but the problem I have is they are almost completely random in how they work depending on what the writer of the story wants them to do. One character can use them and it would send them to a random place, which would be fine. But then we see Shadow able to go to very specific points in time. You can't have both forms. If you have time travel that contradicts itself, then all you're doing is confusing the audience, especially when time travel itself already convolutes the story enough. It also doesn't help when you have situations like this, where one character can use a rift that another character had, only for both characters to end up in completely separate places. We'll see this again in Silver's story, where Sonic is able to go to the past using the rift, whereas Silver goes to the future. Why does that happen? Shouldn't they both go to the same point in time? Let's just get back to the story. Once back in the present, Shadow catches up with Rouge, who tells him that Eggman's robots are trying to find him, which she concludes is really Eggman's trying to find Mephiles, which makes a bit of sense seeing as they both look alike now. This causes Shadow to follow Eggman through the radical train stage that gave me shit in Sonic's playthrough. The difference here is Shadow has to destroy the train instead of saving it. It would be funny if this was the same train, I guess. After catching up with Eggman's train, Shadow tries to get information out of Eggman, with the Doctor really only revealing that Mephiles is connected to the Solaris project that happened 10 years ago. The only way Eggman is willing to give more information is if Shadow captures Mephiles again and brings him to him. Seeing as he doesn't really have any other leads, he heads out to capture Mephiles, only to run into Sonic, who's being attacked by Silver again. Stepping between the two, he fights Silver, which at least leads to probably the best part of this entire game.
Chaos Control!
Never gets old. Silver, probably after being treated like a joke in his debut game, tries to use Chaos Control against Shadow, only for the two of them to accidentally open another time rift. Shadow explains to Silver that Mephiles is the real villain and can show proof as long as Silver follows him to the past, which he does, leading the two to end up in a Soleanna lab where the king is experimenting on their god. There's only one of 5 ways this will end, and none of them are good. Yeah, that's not gonna help. And sure enough, Immediately, the lab blows up, with the scientists accidentally creating both Mephiles and Iblis. That at least tells Silver who the real bad guy is, with the two getting away. Silver ends up going after Iblis, and Shadow goes after Mephiles. And after running through these labs, we are able to catch up with him. Shadow quickly imprisons him in the Scepter of Darkness, which explains why Mephiles knew Shadow in the present. Now, it is a bit confusing, but I'll try and explain it the best I can. This is an example of a bootstrap paradox, which is fairly common in time travel stories. Essentially, Shadow was always supposed to seal Mephiles in the past because Mephiles says he does. Another great example of this is in Ocarina of Time. In that game, Link learns the Song of Storms from an annoyed musician who says a kid played the song and forced the windmill to spin rapidly. Of course, when Link learns this song, he then goes back in time and is revealed to be the kid who first played the song in the first place. Anyway, with Mephiles and Iblis now sealed, Silver and Shadow return to the present, where Shadow, now with the knowledge of how to seal Mephiles again, goes to find him in the desert. After a quick boss fight, Shadow attempts to seal Mephiles only for him to criticize him for trying the same trick twice. Ironically, he does this after trying to get Shadow to join him again. You would think he would see the irony in this, but no one in this game has two brain cells to rub together, as I mentioned. Shadow then proceeds to remove the inhibitor rings he has on his wrist, something hilariously enough that they took from Sonic X, and continues to fight Mephiles. Unfortunately, we don't see this fight, as this is where Shadow's stories end. I also skipped past this, but before the final boss with Mephiles, there is a stage where you get to play as Gamma as he tries to hunt down Mephiles. And it's fine. I mean, you can easily cheese the stage because there's no meter for Gamma's flight, and if you just keep hitting the jump or hover button, he could hover indefinitely. At least here we learn that Gamma is supposed to be the one that seals Shadow away in the future, which means at some point he had to betray his friend. And it would be a more interesting plot point if this story actually meant anything to, well, anyone. Now, something I brought up with Sonic's story is the development of this game was chaotic. I don't want to go into too much detail. You can find different videos that actually talk about the full development. But for now, I will say this. The game was shown in 2005, a year before it would have come out, but during its development, Yuji Naka left Sega to start his own company, which left the project a bit hectic, seeing as he was the main lead and now they had to shift focus. I would call him an asshole again for this situation, which granted, it was a dick move, but at the same time, I'm kinda with him. If I've seen a lot of these projects go up in smoke, I'd want to get out as fast as I can. Unfortunately, they had to get this game out by Christmas of 2006, so they didn't have time to make the game they wanted to make. Allegedly, the version we got wasn't even a finished version and was a prototype that was sent out instead of what was intended. I don't know if I believe that, but it is a story that I've seen go around a couple times. And honestly, it actually makes sense considering how much of a broken mess this game is. That's not to say the game couldn't have shipped in a poor state, but it would have at least been a little more polished. One of the other theories I've seen go around with this game is that at one point it was meant to be a series reboot for Sonic, but I'm sorry, I just don't believe that. Every part of this story acts as a continuation from previous games, even if they don't immediately address something. Personally, I feel that if this was supposed to be a true reboot, like people say, then why do the characters act as though they've known each other for years? That's not to say you couldn't do a reboot and have them do that, but the fact that they actually seem to have some sort of history, as if this is a continuation and not a these characters have never existed before, it just doesn't add up. Hell, Rouge is working for Gun, and Shadow very clearly feels like a version that went through the same shit he went through in his own solo game. It just doesn't add up. I don't get why people keep calling this a reboot when nothing in this game feels like it's meant to be a reboot of any past game. Just like how the time anomalies that have affected our ship so far don't add up. Well, it's almost as if the anomalies don't want us to review this game. But other than a diehard fan, I don't know what would want to do that. Unless... Pixel, brace yourself. I know what's causing the anomalies, and we're gonna get hit by a pretty big one.